Vivienne and Michael first crossed paths during their academic years at the university. Vivienne had chosen her major solely on her parents' insistence, while Michael was rather indifferent about his educational direction. Their initial encounter occurred during a break at the campus cafeteria. From that moment, they engaged in lengthy conversations, which eventually blossomed into a romantic relationship. They exchanged vows in their senior year of university. For 8 years, Vivienne remained at the same job, and with each passing year, she grew increasingly disillusioned with her career field. Moreover, her relationship with her superiors was far from cordial. Eventually, everyone reaches their breaking point. It was at this juncture that Vivienne resolved it was time for a radical change, not just in her job, but in her career path entirely. However, the burden of existing loan commitments meant she couldn't just recklessly abandon her current situation. Relying solely on her husband's income wasn't viable if they wanted to maintain their standard of living and manage her financial liabilities. Sure, she'd throw in the towel, just like a few pals, and let her hubby carry the weight. But realistically, she knew he couldn't shoulder that burden. So she rolled up her sleeves and started juggling retraining classes alongside her regular 9-to-5. Somewhere down the line, she hit a wall. Too much on her plate. Job, classes, digging up and devouring extra material. On top of that, shuttling to her grandma's place, 'cause the old lady was sick and needed some TLC. Juggling all these balls in the air, she barely had a minute to doll up like she used to or take care of herself. Heck, there were nights she grabbed a measly 4 hours of shut-eye. Her sleek hairstyles gave way to a no-fuss ponytail, and those killer heels, swapped for comfy sneakers. Well, it is what it is. Bit by a bit, Vivienne was metamorphosing from a vibrant, blooming young woman into a wearied steed. She reassured herself that this phase was merely temporary. Soon she would wrap up her studies, snag a more rewarding job, and life would ease up. Regarding her career shift, she didn't broach the topic with Michael, her spouse. Once, she had voiced concerns about her unsatisfying job to him, yet he shrugged it off. His response was that everyone just has to grit their teeth and endure distasteful jobs. That's just the way life rolls, and it's perfectly normal. Everything else was running on an even keel after all. So when Vivienne signed up for the course, her husband was dismissive. He complained bitterly about the extra loan Vivienne had taken out for her training, lambasting it as an unnecessary outlay. The pair even clashed fiercely over it once, but, as is often the case, eventually the squabble fizzled out. They simply swept it under the rug and avoided the subject thereafter. Michael found himself increasingly aware of the change in his wife's demeanor due to the additional responsibilities she had assumed. She no longer held the same allure for him. He used to delight solely in her familiar presence. Now, her appearance seemed altered, much to his dissatisfaction. Frequent sharp comments slipped from his mouth almost daily, each centered around Vivienne's looks or her diminishing charm. Initially, she managed to shrug off his cruel words, but over time, they began to sting deeply. "Can't you just stop with the harsh words?" Vivienne finally snapped back after enduring yet another snide comment. Michael shot her a scornful look. "Or perhaps you could start taking care of yourself. Look at you. You hardly resemble the woman you once were." With those biting words, he briskly turned his back and strode into the next room. Vivienne's eyes welled up with tears of frustration. She was incredibly steamed at her husband, and for the following days, they didn't utter a single word to each other. Throughout the week, Vivienne wandered around in a state of utter dismay due to her husband's hurtful comments. She was painfully aware that her appearance had changed, and there were times she couldn't even recognize herself in the mirror. Staring back at her was a weary, gaunt woman with an unhealthy pallor. The only silver lining was her colleague, Brooks. He had been part of the company for several years, and from the earliest days Vivienne remembered, he had always gazed at her with admiration. Regardless of her appearance, he had a knack for showering her with compliments that inevitably brightened her day. She realized that Brooks had harbored deep feelings for her for quite some time, Yet she made a conscious effort to overlook it. They were mere coworkers, with Vivienne already in a committed relationship. One morning, Vivienne arrived at her workplace as usual, only to find a splendid bouquet of her beloved white roses awaiting her on the desk. Perplexed, she scanned the room in search of the sender. Locking eyes with Brooks, she was met with a warm smile. Everything suddenly fell into place. As the end of the shift drew near, Brooks approached Vivienne, asking, "Shall we grab dinner together?" His gaze filled with the same adoration he had always shown towards her. Vivienne gazed back at him, her heart racing with intensity. Not even her husband bestowed upon her such a look anymore. A tremor passed through her as she recollected his recent actions. "Sure, let's do it," Vivienne unexpectedly replied to herself. She chose not to inform Michael about her delayed arrival, instead opting to unwind and allow the situation to unfold. Throughout the evening, Brooks proved remarkably attentive, and they enjoyed each other's company immensely. As they bid each other farewell, they embraced in a friendly manner before heading their separate ways. Upon Vivienne's return to their apartment, her husband anxiously awaited her in the hallway. He erupted into a fit of yelling, derogatorily labeling her as a wild child. Vivienne didn't engage in a heated argument with him. Her mind was consumed by thoughts of Brooks, and her resolution had already been set. Their initial closeness occurred a week later. Initially, Vivienne merely desired to engage in it, once as a form of retaliation against her spouse, but subsequently, it was happening repeatedly. Her spouse had not laid a hand on her for a substantial period, whereas Brooks was exceptionally proficient. Their connection tugged at Vivienne's being like a powerful whirlpool. When a woman has a man who adores her in her existence, she thrives. As a result, despite the relentless pace of her life, Vivienne started to metamorphose simply by perpetually carrying a cheerful disposition, reflecting on her nocturnal escapades. Her countenance no longer bore the weight of exhaustion, her cascading locks exuded vitality, and her gait regained its lightness. Of course, Michael picked up on the shifts in his wife's behavior. Even though she claimed she was heading to extra classes with her course instructor after hours, Michael sensed something wasn't quite right. One afternoon, he wrapped up work early and decided to swing by her office to surprise her. He thought he might drive her to her class, and in the process, meet this mystery teacher. But oh, how much simpler the truth turned out to be. With his own eyes, he witnessed his wife stepping out of the building, a man politely holding the door open for her. She beamed at him, her eyes lingering a tad too long. Ah, Michael knew that look well. The same look she had given him back when their university romance was blossoming. Vivienne and her coworker discreetly glanced around the office entrance, then entwined their fingers and sauntered over to a nearby parked car. Michael was suddenly ablaze with a mix of fury and envy, and without thinking, he charged toward the duo. He seized the man by his shirt, shouting something incoherent, and quickly resorted to physical aggression. Vivienne shrieked in distress until a concerned passerby intervened and pulled the men apart. "Don't even think about coming home," Michael snarled at Vivienne. "You can collect your belongings from the curb." Before the ink was dry on their divorce papers, Vivienne had already moved in with Brooks, much to his delight. At the time, Vivienne was just wrapping up her courses and had secured a new job, so it seemed like things were looking up. Fortunately, since they were no longer coworkers, there wouldn't be any whispers about their relationship at her old workplace. Vivienne and Brooks shared a home for 6 months, during which Vivienne continually marveled at how considerate Brooks was, a stark contrast to her former husband. However, as time passed, Vivienne started to notice that Brooks's gentleness sometimes bordered on excessive meekness, which dumbfounded her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was assuming the more dominant role in the relationship, a situation with which she grew increasingly discontent. Ultimately, their relationship came to an end, and even during the breakup, Brooks's soft nature stood out. He simply wept when Vivienne announced her intention to leave. Post-split, Vivienne left the shared apartment. By then, she was well established in her new job and could comfortably afford a decent place of her own. Though she continued to date, finding a suitable partner proved challenging, but she didn't lose hope. Her only regret was the considerable time she wasted on men who were a poor match for her.